Kia ora koutou. My name is Melanie Prinsloo and I'm a clinical psychologist with the Rosalie Clinic in Auckland, New Zealand. And for the next few minutes, I would like to talk to you about ADHD and executive function. This is important because strengthening the executive function actually goes quite a long way in the overall treatment or management of ADHD. So you may ask, well, what are executive functions and how does that actually link to ADHD? So what we do know is that when we talk about ADHD or the management of ADHD, the part of the brain that is very important when we talk about ADHD is the front part of the brain, the frontal lobes. And the frontal lobes play a key role in managing what we call higher cognitive functions or executive functions. That is our ability to plan, organize, problem solve, manage emotions and behaviors. What is also important is the role of dopamine. So you may have heard the word dopamine come up quite a bit when we talk about ADHD. And when we look at the dopamine pathway, we can see that it actually cuts through this front part of the brain. It cuts through the frontal lobes. So let me give an example. I might, for example, ask Johnny to go upstairs and fetch my shoes, my hat, and my wallet. Now, depending on the amount of dopamine that Johnny has available to him on the day, he may be able to go upstairs and collect all of these items and bring them back. If he is quite low on dopamine, he may go upstairs, collect one or two of the items and bring them. Or if he's really low on dopamine, he may go upstairs, get a bit distracted, and perhaps decide to take a nap or go on his phone. So dopamine becomes really important because it is essentially a chemical or a neurotransmitter that transfers or transports messages from one brain cell or neuron to the other. So if we have sufficient dopamine between our neurons, it allows us to successfully complete a task to the best of our ability. So that is why the frontal lobes are quite important, the roles that they play, as well as dopamine and the pathway that connects to the frontal lobes. So it could be really helpful to perhaps make yourself a list of the different executive functions and to have a good understanding of what they each involve, and to identify which of these executive functions you may need to prioritize to strengthen. And that will help with the practical management of ADHD. So as you can see, there are quite a few executive functions. And as you look at different books or articles, the wording might be slightly different, or some of these may be clumped together. But essentially, we see that there are quite a few of these executive functions. So what I'll do is I will briefly give a definition of each and an idea or two of practically what you may be able to start doing to strengthen some of these executive functions as a starting point. Okay. So sustained attention is essentially our ability to keep paying attention to a task, despite that it might be a boring task, it might be quite repetitive, or despite fatigue setting in or being distracted. So something that could be useful is to figure out what is your baseline. So how long can you pay attention to a task before you notice yourself becoming distracted or finding the task quite monotonous or boring? So you can always use a kitchen timer and see, well, is it 5 minutes? Is it 10 or 15 minutes? and gradually challenge yourself 30 seconds more, a minute more, 2 minutes more to lengthen your ability to pay attention. Another way could be to make your tasks more interesting, to perhaps have breaks where you may leave the room and move around, because we know that movement stimulates dopamine, and dopamine helps us to focus and pay attention. Then we have organization. So that is our ability to develop some sort of a system and to keep track of important bits. So step by step, following a plan to completion. So if we think about something like cooking or baking, for example, I might have to mix ingredients before I put them in the oven, or I might have to chop up the vegetables before I put them in the pot. So it's a step-by-step process, but certain steps need to happen before others can take place. A good practical way to develop your organization skills would be to perhaps pick a day in the holiday and to plan that holiday, do something that requires a few steps, and to afterwards maybe review how you've gone. Did you have the right steps? Did you follow them in order? And how did that go for you? The next would be planning and prioritizing. So this is essentially how to create a plan, have certain goals. Well, what do I want to achieve? To follow these steps and to complete. So if you have quite a big task, it could be useful to break these up into smaller bits. We call that chunking, and to schedule these and to have reminders for each of these little bits. A practical way to help develop your planning and prioritizing could be to find a board game that involves different steps and some planning, and to strengthen this executive function in quite a creative way. Then we have task initiation, and that is basically our ability to start a task without procrastination, without putting it off till the last minute. So it could be useful, again, to break a bigger task into smaller chunks that are more manageable, to create some reminders for yourself, whether that's a visual cue or a sticky note or an alarm on your phone, so that these smaller bits appear more manageable. And a very helpful way to go about is also to forward think. So how will I feel, let's say, later today once I've started with a particular task? What would be the benefits if I complete this task? So it allows us to think forward and to focus on the positives. Time management and time estimation, they sort of link and go together, but that is our ability to manage our time effectively and to estimate how long a task might take. So maintaining a schedule could be useful, using something like a calendar, whether that is the traditional paper-based calendar or a virtual calendar or diary. And a good way to develop this executive functioning is, again, maybe pick a day in the holiday where something takes place. It might take time, and see if you can estimate or guesstimate almost how long that task would take, and afterwards review how you went with managing your time and how close are you with estimating how long these things take. Then we have working memory. That is our ability to hold information in our mind while we're performing a task. So if we think about something like perhaps doing mathematics, so I might be busy with a mathematical equation or a problem, and for a very short period of time, I need to keep all of those numbers in my mind so that I can do something with those numbers. It could be useful to develop your working memory, your capacity, by you might remember some of those practical card games where you have to remember where certain pairs are. For example, you may need to find a pair of elephants with different cards that you turn over. So that is a practical way of developing working memory. When you, for example, ask someone who struggles with ADHD to do something, it can help them to make sure that you make eye contact, to ask the person to repeat your request to make sure that they understand, and sometimes to have a visual cue or a reminder, a tick list for them to follow. Response inhibition is the opposite basically of impulsivity. So this is thinking before acting. That is the ability to learn to wait. And if we develop this executive function, we are able to tolerate some frustration. And a good way or a practical way to develop this is basically to postpone some rewards. So if I, for example, have to complete a household task that takes quite long, it might be quite boring and monotonous, but I schedule some reward for myself that is not too time consuming and it doesn't cost any money, but it helps me with my motivation. So I might schedule, let's say, going for a jog, if that is something that I enjoy normally, to take place after doing a task that I find quite boring, instead of I'm doing it first thing in the morning because I enjoy it. Emotional control, that is our ability to manage emotions. And interestingly enough, that is part of that front part of the brain, the frontal lobes. And here we might need to develop some coping mechanisms. So depending on the person, it may be something like exercise, whether it's going for a jog, whether it's jumping on a trampoline. For others, it might be yoga or breathing. We also talk a lot about progressive muscle relaxation. And for others, it may simply be stroking a pet that helps us to return to equilibrium. But that is essentially also a skill to develop. Flexibility is our ability to revise plans and to adapt to change. And this might be useful when it's difficult to adjust to change or unforeseen change, to bring in change in your life in small bits and to challenge yourself in that way, to brainstorm strategies of how to deal with changes that come up. Then we have goal-directed persistence, and that is our ability to carry on with a task and to complete it. Our brain naturally avoids effort, and it's even more so when someone might struggle with ADHD. So having a sort of incentive or a reward can help motivate us to carry on with a task and to complete it. When we talk about reward systems or incentives, again, it is not about rewarding yourself with something that costs money. It is using something in your everyday life that you normally like to do anyway as your motivation to schedule it after a task that you find boring or monotonous, and using that as your reward for completion. And we can also see that basically postponing some of your goals or having your reward take place in a couple of days can also help to develop that skill. Lastly, we have metacognition, and this is our ability to self-monitor and self-evaluate. So having insight into our own behavior and the behavior of others. So here it can be very helpful for people with ADHD if we give them feedback or praise to be very specific. So not just to say, job well done, but basically to be very specific around what the behavior is that you would like to see more of. So you might say, oh, John, I am so impressed with your ability to follow your plan, or your ability to manage your time so well with this big task that you were busy with. So being more specific helps the person develop that insight and ability to self-monitor. This is also about developing the skill or the capacity to pick up body language and tone of voice. Again, that ability to have insight into the behaviors of others. So in closing, I just want to highlight again that looking at these different executive functions, having an understanding of what they each mean, and identifying the ones that might be key in your life to strengthen and develop could be a very good starting point in the practical management of ADHD. Ngā mihi nui.